For centuries, there was one official path towards God, and man's guide on that path was the Pope, an idea which the Reformation rejected. When a Lutheran pastor today takes as his text Romans chapter 5, he preaches on the central theme of the Reformation, that a personal faith in God is all that a man needs for salvation. This pastor in West Germany gives his congregation wine as well as bread in the communion service. And he lives a normal family life with his wife and 3 children. Such behavior, perfectly familiar to modern Protestants, would have caused cries of scandal and heresy in the old Europe dominated by Rome, the Europe which was to be shaken when an obscure monk made an act of protest at this church door in Wittenberg one day in 1517. His protest was triggered by an event in the nearby town of Jüterbog. A contemporary described the arrival here of a man who preached on the Pope's behalf.
All the priests, monks, councilmen, teachers, pupils, men, women, maids and children went to meet him singing in solemn procession with flags and candles. The bells tolled, and when he entered the church, the organ played. Even God himself could not have been welcomed and received more beautifully.
The preacher who was received with such pomp and ceremony that day in Jüterbog offered the congregation, here in this church, what seemed a wonderful spiritual bargain. For a small down payment, he told them, they could escape punishment in purgatory for their sins. When they died, they could go straight to heaven. They could even buy the same benefit for friends and relations who had already died. And this distinctly commercial transaction was offered to them on the authority of the Pope himself. Many such preachers were traveling to raise money for the Pope, but the people of Jüterbog were being offered Rome's bargain by Johann Tetzel, the friar who was the most skillful of all the Pope's salesmen. Tetzel traveled with a big chest like this one, and the chest was the centerpiece of his performance. Into it went the people's money, and out of it came what he was selling, indulgences. Scraps of printed parchment with the Pope's seal and with a space left free for people's name to be written in when they'd bought it. Tetzel's sales pitch included a vivid description of people's dead fathers and mothers roasting in the flames, crying out for release. And he ended with a famous jingle. He would say, "As soon as the coin in my big chest rings, a soul from purgatory springs." It seems that he even told people that this document was powerful enough to save someone who had raped the mother of Jesus himself, the Virgin Mary. And it was details such as that which led Tetzel's visit here to Jüterbog to become notorious, when some of his well-satisfied customers had walked the 25 miles home to their own town, Wittenberg. Wittenberg was a small town, but a distinguished one. It was prosperous, and it even had a new university founded by the local prince, Duke Frederick the Wise. Frederick was a good Catholic, but he was intensely conscious of being German. He distrusted foreigners, particularly Italians. His dream was to turn Wittenberg into a center for all German pilgrims, a place to rival the popularity of Rome herself. In his castle church here at Wittenberg, Frederick had the best collection of relics in the whole of Germany. He even had a printed catalogue made of them, much as a modern collector of art or sculpture might. On the frontispiece, he had himself shown with his brother. And then, the real matter of the collection. Precious containers in all sorts of shapes and sizes, holding thousands of bits of saints and martyrs and holy places. This silver model of the baby Jesus, for example, has beside it a list of all the oddments from his babyhood which it contained. 13 bits of the manger, a portion of his nappy, and so on down the list. And on certain days of the year, all these relics were on show in Frederick's castle church. Anyone who saw them all and bought the right indulgences could save himself nearly 2 million years in purgatory. And in this particular year, 1517, people were also returning from Jüterbog with stories of Tetzel and of raping the Virgin Mary. The combination of all these preposterous ideas was too much for a tormented young monk who taught in the university here at Wittenberg, Martin Luther.
I am the son of a peasant. My great-grandfather, grandfather, and father were peasants. That I became a monk bitterly annoyed my father, but I persisted in my decision.
The most important day of the whole year for Frederick and his relics was All Saints' Day. That's when the real crowds of pilgrims came. And on the very evening before the big day, Luther came and nailed to the door of Frederick's Castle Church a handwritten list of 95 propositions, or theses. Today, the old wooden doors are no longer there. They've been replaced by these bronze ones, which have in them the text of the famous theses. Luther's main argument was that the sale of indulgences was a fraud, and that any pope who encouraged it had betrayed Christ. Well, there was bound to be trouble. Not only was Frederick the man who had founded the very university at which Luther taught theology, but he even subsidized it with money from the sale of indulgences. Even so, Luther himself must have been amazed at quite how much fuss there was. And it didn't come from Frederick. Luther had written his theses in Latin, and posting them on the door of a church was the normal way of inviting scholars to join him in debate. But this purely local act suddenly turned into a full-scale European row. The real reason was that many people already shared Luther's feelings about the corrupt ways of Rome. But the speed and the violence of the response had another cause, the recent development of printing. A printing museum in the German town of Mainz commemorates the invention of printing by Johann Gutenberg in about 1450. Gutenberg used his press for the slow and expensive business of producing printed pages which could rival the perfection of manuscripts. "70 years later, every town had its press. Pages could now be printed quickly, cheaply, secretly. The urgency and violence of a pamphlet war became possible. And just such a war followed when printers began turning out copies of Luther's 95 Theses. It was said that in 2 weeks all Germany had read them, and in 4 all Europe. The pamphlets, like the cartoons of the time, were violent and abusive. The Pope and his friars might be satirized as the devil's bagpipes. But the Pope had what until now had always been the ultimate weapon. He excommunicated Luther, and the books of the heretic monk were burnt in Rome. But this time the Pope's weapon misfired. Hearing that Luther's books had been burnt in Rome, the students and the teachers of Wittenberg University marched out of town singing a Te Deum, and then they burnt all the old books of papal law and of medieval theology. As a climax, Luther himself came and threw on the flames the document which had arrived from the Pope excommunicating him. It was all very exciting and highly unusual. Until now, the Pope could have expected a prince or a university to hand over an excommunicated heretic. And if Frederick had sent Luther to Rome, Luther himself would certainly have gone into the flames. But Frederick was protecting his star lecturer, and Wittenberg was turning its heretic into a hero. So much, it seemed, for the Pope. But there was one other supreme authority above both Frederick and Wittenberg, and this time a German authority, the Emperor Charles V.
I speak Italian to women, French to men, Spanish to God, and German to my horse.
Charles's many languages reflected the vast areas of Europe over which he ruled. Spain, southern Italy, parts of France. But the most troublesome of his territories was the one over which he'd been elected emperor, his German empire, known as the Holy Roman Empire. The princes who made up the Holy Roman Empire were supposed to be obedient both to Christ and the emperor. Yet now a German city was sheltering an excommunicated heretic. If that was allowed, anarchy and chaos seemed to lie ahead. So Wittenberg's heretic was summoned to appear before Charles at the city of Worms, where the emperor guaranteed his safety. Luther set off, and Wittenberg no doubt heard later with pride how he'd refused to be browbeaten. "Here I stand, I cannot do otherwise," he's supposed to have said. He wouldn't budge from his views unless the emperor's men could prove him wrong from Scripture. And so the emperor, who was more interested in obedience than in debate, declared that the excommunicated monk was now to be an outlaw as well. And then, the very next thing that Wittenberg heard, a shocking piece of news. Their hero had vanished. He'd been kidnapped. Once Luther had left Worms under the emperor's safe conduct, it was the duty of every German to seize him as an outlaw. And as he was bumping along in his cart, armed men rode up and carried him off to this castle. It wasn't the disaster it seemed. The castle, known as the Wartburg, belonged to Frederick the Wise. Here Luther stayed in hiding for more than a year, disguised as a young nobleman, Squire George. And Squire George used his enforced leisure to begin a mighty task. In the incredibly short time of 3 months, in this room, Luther completed his translation of the whole New Testament. It would be hard enough work for most of us just to copy it out in that time. But he translated it, and he didn't even have a dictionary here with him. He just had the Greek and the Latin texts. There had been German translations of the Bible before, but they'd been dusty, scholarly affairs. What was new about Luther's was that he had a genius for words, and he believed in using ordinary words. It's no good, he said, going back to old dictionaries to look for words. We must ask the housewife in her kitchen, children in the streets, the common man in the marketplace. The important fact was that the Bible, with its stories, its ideas, its illustrations, was now to become a familiar part of every Protestant home. Even more than most people of his own time, Luther believed in the physical reality of devils. "I have," he said, "2 devils who keep a close watch on me, and are very purposeful devils." In fact, the most famous story connected with this room was of how the devil one day was so purposeful in distracting Luther as he worked away at the table, that Luther, in exasperation, finally flung his pot of ink at him. And for centuries, pilgrims were shown a great stain of ink on the wall here. Unfortunately, they all wanted to take away a relic of the great man, so they licked their thumbs, pressed them against the ink. And so, year after year, right up till 1930, it was found necessary to replaster the entire wall and to splash it once more with good, fresh ink. Today, we prefer the bare bones of legend. A poor peasant at his plough, partnered by death. There had often in the past been peasant uprisings in Germany, but now the oppressed were given new heart by Luther's own stand against authority, and by finding in the Bible that God is often against proud rulers and on the side of the poor. In the town of Mühlhausen, now in East Germany, the peasants were inspired by a one-time follower of Luther, who found in the Bible the fate that lay in store for the rich.
The eternal living God has commanded that you be pushed from your chair with the power that is given us. You are unprofitable to Christendom. The scriptures say that your nest is to be torn out and destroyed.
Das Volk wird frei werden. The people will be free. On the walls of this museum at Mühlhausen, there are quotations which one would expect to come from Marx or Lenin. They come from Thomas Müntzer, who believed that the reign of Christ on earth would only begin when the poorest classes, untainted by wealth and power, had overthrown their masters. In this he went far beyond the ideas of Luther, and there was little that Thomas Müntzer enjoyed quite as much as abusing the man he had once followed. That soft, living lump of flesh at Wittenberg was only one of his favorite names for Luther. Luther at first had some sympathy for the demands of the peasants, but he was soon horrified by their random violence. He wrote a pamphlet with a provocative title, Against the Murderous and Thieving Hordes of Peasants.
Let anyone who can smite, slay, and stab, remembering that nothing can be more devilish than a rebel. It is just as when one must kill a mad dog.
By now, several princes were followers of Luther. They marched with the Catholic princes to defeat the peasants. There were terrible reprisals. It was said that 100,000 peasants died in an orgy of aristocratic revenge. It was a brutal retaliation. Brutal even by the standards of an age which made its punishments as public as possible. The established order had won, but Charles V had other problems in Germany. Catholic and Lutheran princes agreed about putting down peasants, but their own differences meant a constant danger of religious war. To try and resolve the matter, Charles called an assembly at Augsburg. Here the Protestant princes were commanded to justify themselves before their emperor. Here they told him that Luther had restored the Church of Christ to its original form. And here they added that if Rome would only follow suit, there'd be no further problem. The Lutheran princes were presenting theological arguments to the emperor. And they were being advised not by Luther himself, but by his lieutenant, Philip Melanchthon, the professor of Greek at Wittenberg. Luther was once again sheltering in a high, rocky castle. He couldn't come to Augsburg because he was still an outlaw. This castle at Coburg was the nearest place in safe hands. Here, that summer of 1530, he waited, nervously. Luther's fear was that without his own rough voice to guide them, the Protestants would make too many concessions. Urgent messages, written by him in this room in the castle, were constantly being smuggled into Augsburg, and the road back was busy with messengers bringing him news of each latest development. He needn't have worried. The Protestant princes stubbornly refused to take part in the many Catholic ceremonies that the emperor kept arranging, and they presented him with a statement of the Protestant faith, written by Melanchthon and now known as the Augsburg Confession, which has remained ever since a basic document of the Lutheran Church. The emperor offered no sort of compromise. Instead, he announced that unless the princes hurried back into the Catholic fold, he would use force to compel them. It was a declaration of war. But it was a hollow one because he hadn't the strength to carry it out. And so for another 25 years, a state of uneasy hostility lasted. Until, at another meeting at Augsburg, the Protestants at last got the concession they needed. In the Peace of Augsburg in 1555, the emperor accepted that each individual prince should have the right to decide whether his territory should be Catholic or Lutheran. Well, that concession came nearly 40 years after Luther had first nailed his theses to the door of the church in Wittenberg. But finally, Wittenberg had won. But the wicked ways of Rome, Luther insisted, must be changed without violence to the new ways of Wittenberg, where the wine as well as the bread is given to the people in the communion service, and God's in his heaven, close to every man, with the message of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit available to all in the Bible which lies open on the pulpit. In those early days here at Wittenberg, the sense of freedom was more than just theological. Inspired by Luther, monks and nuns were streaming out of their cloisters, such as this one, to start a new life. Many of them were young and they were eager to marry. A student in Wittenberg described 9 nuns arriving from a nearby convent. A wagon load of virgins has just come to town, he wrote. God grant them husbands, lest worse befall. Well, God, with some energetic help from Luther, found husbands for 8 of them. That left just 1. That last one was Catherine von Bora, and Luther found a husband for her too. Cranach, as usual, was on hand to provide their portraits. For their married home, Martin and Catherine moved into the very building where Luther had lived as a monk. The monastery suddenly had a new lease of life. There is a lot to get used to in marriage, Luther said. One wakes up in the morning to find on the pillow a pair of pigtails which were not there before. And soon there was something else to get used to as well. He wrote to a friend, "My Catherine is fulfilling Genesis 1:28. There is about to be born a child of a monk and a nun." And soon this old monastery was swarming with children. Martin and Catherine had 6 of their own, and they adopted 4 orphans as well. And after the initial shock, Luther decided that it even improved the spiritual life of a priest to lend a hand with the nappies. God and his angels will smile, he said, not because nappies are washed, but because it is done in faith. In effect, this was the first vicarage.
Komm, Herr Jesus, sei du unser Gast und segne, was du uns bescheret hast. Amen. Gesegnete Mahlzeit.
Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John stoned the unfortunate Pope. All the Protestants agreed that the Bible was excellent ammunition against Rome. But a Protestant prince, Philip of Hesse, was appalled to hear that the Reformers even disagreed among themselves about what the Bible said. To resolve their differences, he summoned a conference in 1529 at his castle of Marburg. The 2 most important guests were Luther and the man who had emerged as the leader of a separate Reformation in Switzerland, Ulrich Zwingli. Tradition has it that the debate took place in this room in 4 sessions over a Saturday and a Sunday, much like a modern weekend conference of experts. The owner of the castle, the 25-year-old Philip of Hesse, presided like an umpire. He'd even invited 60 of his friends in to watch the contest. The Reformers sat round a table in the middle. Each of them naturally came armed only with a Bible. The main question was what happens when the priest consecrates the bread and the wine in the communion service.
Das ist mein Leib, der für euch hingegeben wird. Mein Blut, das für euch und für alle vergossen wird, zur Vergebung der Sünden. Tut dies zu meinem Gedächtnis.
The Catholic theory was that at that moment, the bread and the wine become literally and entirely the body and blood of Christ. Well, Luther took a position fairly close to this. He couldn't quite believe that no bread or wine remained. He trusted his own eyes a little too much for that. But he maintained that the sacrament became both things at the same time. He said that the body and blood of Christ remained with, in, and under the bread and the wine. His text was Matthew chapter 26, verse 26, when Jesus gives bread to his disciples and says, "Take, eat, this is my body." Luther opened the proceedings in his usual blunt manner. He took a piece of chalk, drew a circle on the table, and wrote in it, "Das ist mein Leib." This is my body. That was what the Bible told him, and that was good enough for him. Well, then it was Zwingli's turn. He insisted that the bread never became the actual body of Christ. It merely represented it in a sacred metaphor. And he turned to John chapter 6, verse 63. "The Spirit alone gives life. The flesh is of no avail." Each man stuck to his text. Tempers rose. Each accused the other of obstinacy and prejudice. Everyone agreed that all truth was in the Bible, but it was becoming painfully clear that the Bible was what you made of it. Marburg provided a vivid glimpse of the Protestant future. Zwingli had carried his own city firmly into the Protestant camp, but Zurich was only one of the small, independent states which made up Switzerland. A few of them followed Zwingli's lead. Most remained fiercely loyal to Rome. Soon Zurich was sending an army out to defend its new Protestant faith against Swiss Catholics, and Zwingli marched to war with the soldiers. The war consisted of only one battle. For one confused day, Protestant Swiss and Catholic Swiss surged about this old abbey of Kappel, whose abbot had turned it into a Protestant school. Zwingli himself eagerly put on a helmet, strapped on a sword and joined the fighting, and was killed. The reaction to his death by Luther, as leader of the other great wing of the Reformation, was extraordinarily unsympathetic. Serve him right, he said, for carrying a sword as a priest, and for having incorrect ideas about the bread and the wine of the Mass. Well, the Catholics won that day at Kappel, and they won the brief war. But Zwingli had planted the Reformation too securely in Switzerland for one defeat to make much difference. And soon the Swiss Federation was to be joined by a powerful new member, Geneva. In one momentous year, 1536, three things happened which were to change Geneva's place in history. The city became free of the neighboring Kingdom of Savoy and joined the city-states of Switzerland. It decided to adopt the Protestant faith, and it welcomed a refugee from France, John Calvin. Calvin created in Geneva what many of his contemporaries regarded as the perfect working model of a Christian city. It wouldn't have suited most of us today. At the most trivial level, dancing was banned, and the bars were ordered to serve nothing but non-alcoholic drinks. Well, needless to say, alcohol soon found its way back, but it was a sign of the times. Geneva was to be made strict, serious, and above all, biblical. Of all the reformers, Calvin had the clearest and most uncompromising mind, and by Catholics he was hated and feared accordingly. In this hostile painting, his face is made up of rotting bits of animals. A modern monument to the reformers in Geneva rightly makes this city seem the real center of the Reformation. Reformers came here to learn their craft from Calvin, much as revolutionaries today might go to Moscow or Peking. One such revolutionary was the man who called Geneva the greatest school of Christ since the days of the apostles, the man who took the Calvinist faith back to his native Scotland, John Knox. In Edinburgh in 1560, Knox persuaded the Parliament to adopt Calvinism. Scotland became the first Christian country with a faith different from that of its monarch. And then, in 1561, the young Catholic Queen, Mary, Queen of Scots, returned here after many years in France. On her very first Sunday at her Palace of Holyrood, she did what was now illegal in Scotland. She attended Mass. From his pulpit in the Cathedral of St. Giles, Knox thundered against the young Queen.
If we join hands with idolatry, God's amicable presence will leave us, and what then shall become of us? I tell ye that one Mass is more fearful to me than if 10,000 armed enemies were landed in any part of the realm, of purpose to suppress the whole religion.
Like most Puritans, John Knox believed that anyone who disagreed with him was already halfway to hell. Soon he was writing darkly about his queen. We call her not a whore, but she was brought up in France among the wildest whoremongers. What she is herself best knows, and God, no doubt, will further declare. Well, not surprisingly, the relationship between the minister and the queen became highly personal. They hated each other. Below the great castle, the people of Edinburgh were taking matters into their own hands. The struggle was about authority as much as religion. Today we're quite used to citizens meeting to take decisions. But when Mary heard that the new Church of Scotland was holding its own assemblies, almost certainly in this small Magdalen chapel, she considered the news highly sinister. A message came from her saying it was suspicious to princes that subjects should assemble themselves without their prince's knowledge. Well, in the end, the struggle between Knox and Mary went Knox's way. When he died, he had an impressive funeral in St. Giles's, at which the Regent of Scotland described him as a man who neither feared nor flattered any flesh. Well, that was certainly true. And by then, Mary was a prisoner in England. But the cousin who held her prisoner, Queen Elizabeth, would have been just as horrified as Mary at the success of Knox's ideas. God help us, said her Archbishop of Canterbury, from such visitation as Knox has attempted in Scotland, the people to be orderers of things. In Tudor England, such democratic notions would have had short shrift. Henry VIII and his family made no bones about who was dictating the religion of England. They were. And although the royal idea of Christianity kept changing, disagreeing with it had one very constant result: the stake. With a fine impartiality, Henry once burnt Catholics and Protestants on the same day, calling them both heretics. But most of the English martyrs were Protestants, burnt by Henry's Catholic daughter, Mary Tudor. During Henry's reign, the chief target had been not so much Catholic lives as Catholic property. It was Henry's constant need for money which led him to close the monasteries, seize their land, and leave us with England's most romantic ruins. The abbeys fell into ruins because the men who bought them from the king wanted only the land on which they stood or the stone of which they were built. But a few were turned by their new owners into fine houses for themselves, and one of the finest was Laycock.
We're standing now in the oldest part of Laycock Abbey. Laycock was founded as a nunnery in the 13th century for Augustinian canonesses, and it continued as a nunnery right through the Middle Ages until Henry VIII's time. And ever since that time, that's the middle of the 16th century, the same family has been living at Laycock.
I doubt whether anyone has ever lived through such a bewildering succession of changes as the people of England in the 16th century. The villagers in a place like Laycock had to make a series of abrupt adjustments as Henry VIII and his three children swung the pendulum of faith back and forth from one extreme to the other. The story of the unfortunate nuns was a typical example. First of all, they were sent back to their homes because the king was about to sell their abbey to William Sharrington. But Henry insisted that no English nun was going to marry. He wasn't going to have any of these newfangled Lutheran ideas from Germany. But then, under his son, Edward VI, England became more genuinely Protestant, and the nuns were told they could marry after all. Many of them did so. But suddenly, Henry's daughter Mary was on the throne, and she was a Roman Catholic. Now, the nuns who were married were told that they had committed a mortal sin in doing so. They were ordered to hurry back into their nuns' costumes. Well, as a matter of fact, their nuns' costumes was about all they had to hurry back into, because not even Queen Mary was able to persuade William Sharrington and his like to move out of the fine houses that they'd paid good money for. And finally, Queen Elizabeth. At last it was declared that the married nuns were legally married women after all. And happily we have a record of at least one who managed to find a husband again after all that, and to resume a married life that had been brutally interrupted by the Counter-Reformation. It was the same when people went to church. Under Henry, the service had been in Latin. Under Edward, it was in English. Under Mary, it was back in Latin. And finally, under Elizabeth, in English again.
Amen.
Equally confusing was the saga of the Great Bible, the first authorized translation into English. The frontispiece shows Henry VIII, who commissioned it, handing the Bible to his archbishop for distribution to the people, who shout in grateful reply, "Vivat Rex, long live the king. God save the king." Every church in the land was ordered to have a copy. And so one day the Great Bible arrived here in the church at Laycock. At last, people could read it for themselves in English. And they were fascinated. In fact, they were so fascinated by what they read, including the often somewhat radical notions which can be found in this book about wealth and kings and Christian ideals, that Henry wondered whether it had been such a good idea to let ordinary people read such a book. A new order arrived. From now on, it was to be read only by noblemen, gentlemen, and rich merchants, plus, as a special concession, noble women, but only in the privacy of their own bedrooms. And so the mad switchback of the English Reformation went on, until at last Queen Elizabeth seemed to be establishing a country in which differences of religious opinion could coexist. But the pressure of the times was against tolerance. After her death, England reverted to extremism and extremist labels. Papists, Puritans, Puritan revolutions, Popish plot. 4 centuries can add a coating of romance to anything. Ruined abbeys look attractive. Abbeys turned into country houses look attractive. In such a setting, it's easy to think of the Reformation as something that happened long ago, something on which the dust of battle and controversy has long since settled. But it hasn't. The violence in Ulster is political, economic, tribal, as well as being religious. But that was equally true of the fanatical and nationalist struggles of the 16th century. The extremists here on both sides are fighting a war that is hundreds of years out of date, as most people in Ulster, both Catholic and Protestant, know to their cost.
The grim tragedy is that the freedom which was won at the time of the Reformation is being threatened today in the name of Protestantism. And it should be made perfectly clear that those who attempt to impose in fascist style the will of a small minority with all the loss and suffering entailed do not speak or act for the vast majority of the Protestant people of Ulster.
That was a speaker at the Protestant Church Assembly in Belfast in 1977. Equally reasonable voices can be heard on the Catholic side. But it's the slogans of the bigots that catch the eye. In the ancient hatreds of Ulster, the violence of the Reformation lingers on. But the positive side of the Reformation has life in it too. Also in 1977, in a church in Edinburgh, there was an event which to Knox would have been inconceivable. In Knox's day, ordained priests began to marry. More recently, women have been ordained. On this day, a husband and wife were ordained together.
On these your servants, Ian and Catherine, whom we in your name and in obedience to your most blessed will, do, by the laying on of our hands, ordain and appoint to the office of the holy ministry, committing to them authority to minister your word and sacraments, and to rule within your church. We give you the right hand of fellowship, and may the grace of the Lord Jesus Christ be with you both.